Hi, so before we get started, I just want to make note of the fact that this is not going to be a normal episode. This is, first of all, it's just me recording alone. Normally I would be with my two co-hosts, Anthony and Cameron, but they are going to be off this week while I go through some of the more key points in my gaming history here. I just felt like with the release of Tears of the Kingdom coming out, I'm recording this on May 8th, 2023. On May 12th, in 4 days from now, the game will be releasing. And just the level of anticipation that I've been seeing both in the community and personally has reminded me of a time period that surrounds the 20-year mark now that we are past. Just a really formative time in my gaming career, and just part of why I love this series so much. Not just what the games represent and what their stories are, but also how they had an effect in my life in terms of the kind of friendships that I built and the kind of communities I ended up getting involved with. Now, 20 years later, I can honestly say that I would have never seen this result. I would have never seen myself becoming this kind of content creator. I would have never known. I mean, back then we just did not have the vision of what today is like, being online, streaming, podcasting, being able to share these experiences with other people. And I'm super grateful for that and the kind of community that's currently being built, both around the podcast, around the streaming on Facebook. And so I kind of wanted to do a little retrospective here on some games that we haven't even covered yet in the podcast. But more importantly, like not necessarily the games themselves, but the kind of anticipation that we all went through when we were waiting for these games and kind of the story of their release now. So what you're going to hear for this episode is more of a personal memoir of the events and how they went down. I'm going to include a little bit of context for things that I really wasn't aware of as a kid, and kind of move into personal experience from there. So, buckle up and we are going to get started with this episode.
Welcome to A4NB4Y.
Welcome to the A4NB4Y podcast, the Legend of Zelda themed podcast, where normally we would go chapter by chapter through a game. In this episode, it's just me. I'm your host, Ryan Fonzie, a gamer like you. And I am here to discuss the history of the Legend of Zelda series as I saw it, mainly focusing on The Wind Waker and Twilight Princess. I feel like there's been a lot of parallels between this Tears of the Kingdom release and those releases in terms of anticipation, what we expected, what we saw, what the community wanted versus what they got, and kind of what it feels like to have a game be delayed. And you may even hear a story of how I ruined 2 different Christmases, both related to Nintendo games. But more about that as we get into it. All right, so we'll get started with some context here. We've discussed this in the show before, and as many of you know, Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask released a year apart from one another back in 1998 and 1999. 1998, Ocarina of Time was Game of the Year, and many people would argue that it's been Game of the game of the existence of gaming. It's on so many top 100 lists, often at the number 1 spot, just for how much of a revolution it was for gaming in general. As one of the first 3D action adventure games, it truly set the bar and made a lot of key decisions that would become what not only The Legend of Zelda was, but what games surrounding it would also become. Like a lot of games in the action RPG genre all kind of follow suit. Majora's Mask, being made a year later, took a lot of those same concepts and developed them further, but was largely a repeat of the formula. Things that people like to see in 3D Zelda games now are, explorable dungeons and a vast array of items, and the hook shot might be one example of something that shows up in a bunch of these games. And so there are certain expectations that people have become accustomed to, which kind of leads me into the year 2000. During this year, there was a Space World exhibit. Now, these were kind of similar, as far as I understand, to an E3 or a PAX, right? I mean, honestly, I wasn't aware of these events when they were happening, but whenever I read the history, it's like a game developer showcase in a way. So in this one, this was the grand reveal of the GameCube, the Nintendo GameCube. Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask were both N64 games. This was the first time that they were trying to showcase their next-gen console, right? And to do this, they did a tech demo, which was essentially a highlight reel of different kind of concepts that they had animated together. Amongst this were some concepts shown for what would become Wave Race, Metroid Prime, Banjo-Kazooie, Luigi's Mansion. And one of the key points in this tech demo was a higher resolution battle between Link and Ganondorf in the style of Ocarina of Time, but with some tweaks made, very much look like it could be the next Legend of Zelda game. And that's how the community kind of interpreted it. You can't blame them, because other games in this same highlight reel, like Luigi's Mansion and Metroid Prime, did become games that would release later on the GameCube, even if they weren't quite exactly what was shown in this tech demo. So a lot of fans just believe that this is where the series was headed, much to their disappointment when next year at Space World 2001, some Wind Waker beta footage was shown. And this footage, if you've seen it, it was very cartoony. Not only was, there was the cell shading that we now know as Toon Link, but the whole reel was Link dodging around moblins and having these very cartoony interactions with moblins, like tricking them to walk off a cliff and stuff like that. And they had like full on Wile E. Coyote type reactions where they realized they were floating in midair and falling down. Like, it was very much a kiddie Zelda that was not what people were expecting after the year before. And so a lot of people were disappointed. This next game that was announced was not what people expected after seeing what could have been. So with the GameCube on its way in 2001, people were not now expecting a Legend of Zelda game that really fully realized the potential that was shown. The GameCube did release on September 14th, 3 days after what many of us would remember as the September 11th attack on the World Trade Center. Now, I don't point that out to make any kind of political statement. It's more just to give a kind of touch point for people who may not remember what kind of time frame I'm talking about here. I mean, we are in the early 2000s. For example, like some movies that released within the month of the GameCube's release were Tremors 3, 13 Ghosts, and Monsters Incorporated. So if you were a kid who knew any of those, you might remember this is about the same time the GameCube released. Moving on from there, in May of 2002, Wind Waker, as it was announced, was delayed to February of 2003. In just a few days from there, on the 21st, Nintendo had brought a demo of Wind Waker to E3 as well. They had delayed it to sometime after February of 2003. And so as they approached that, in December of 2002, the game was finally delayed to what would end up being its release date of March 24th, 2003. So this is just like a snapshot of 2002. Some notable movies from that year would be like Attack of the Clones, like Star Wars Attack of the Clones. Mr. Deeds came out that year. Star Trek Nemesis and Lord of the Rings: The Two Towers. Unfortunately, yes, those are all 21 years old at this point. So March 24th of 2003, the Wind Waker was released. I was in 5th grade at the time. Wildly enough, right before that happened, on March 19th, the U.S. had invaded Iraq. And even before that, March 14th, the movie Agent Cody Banks had come out. Sorry for the ironic juxtaposition of those two things. It's just, these were like the biggest things I found with a quick search just on what was happening in March of 2003. So if you remember the movie Agent Cody Banks, I mean, I was of the age demographic, being in 5th grade at the time. And, yeah, it was kind of a big deal for me and my group of friends. Not that we became Cody Banks fans, but I remember very distinctly that movie circulating and going to friends' birthdays, and it was just playing in the background. Yeah, it's a very weird thing that happened during this time where we were kids in school and our country was at war in a way that we didn't fully understand or grasp, mainly because of our age. So moving on from there, sometime in the summer of 2003, I was upstairs in the apartment above my parents' house. It was now unoccupied. Previous years, it had been the home of the mother of a few of my best friends from childhood. They didn't go to the same school that I did, but they were there every other weekend. And they were the ones who actually introduced me to Ocarina of Time, which I wouldn't be getting until this year here. In 2003, as I was up in the now abandoned apartment that was being used for storage, I remembered that there were, Halloween costumes kind of stored in one of the crawl spaces in the upstairs closet. And I wanted to go see what was there. I remember some board games there as well. And I was just kind of browsing around. I wasn't really looking for anything specific. But when I opened up the closet to go find these old costumes and to kind of just look through, what instead I found was a boxed fresh GameCube Platinum Edition with the Game Boy player as well, as a package deal. And I was so surprised by this and confused by this, and I did not put two and two together. See, at the time, that was something that I would have wanted more than anything else. As a kid, that would have been on my birthday wish list, on my Christmas list. And funnily enough, that was part of why it was there. But I didn't know that at the time. And I went downstairs and I asked my mom, I said, hey, so why is there a GameCube in the closet upstairs? Yeah, I was up there and I just saw a GameCube on the floor. Just like, silly me hadn't thought through that this question could have been building a reputation that would later be realized. And we'll get to that as well. But the explanation that I was given at the time was that, oh yeah, that's for your cousins for Christmas. Now, my parents were pretty generous with stuff like that. It wouldn't be unheard of for them to give my two cousins a joint gift of a GameCube between the two of them. Though, I mean, it might be a little bit more generous than normal, but nothing that couldn't have been the truth. And so I believed them. And this GameCube made its way downstairs and sat on a buffet of sorts. That's what we called it. We called it the buffet. It was like, I don't know, a chest of drawers or something that we just kept it by the front entrance of the house. And so this GameCube sat there. My cousin's GameCube sat on this thing as a Christmas gift for someone else, up until Christmas morning when I unwrapped it under the tree. And so 2 years past the release of the GameCube, I got the one that had the Game Boy player, which is convenient because I had actually been pretty much a Game Boy kid up until that point. I never had owned an actual Nintendo console before then. We had a Sega Genesis. We might have even had the PS1 around that same time. But I'd always loved these Nintendo games, but never had a way to play them because I never had the system. With this GameCube came Ocarina of Time, my first official Zelda game, and it was everything. Like it was probably one of the best Christmases I can remember, mainly because of that, because it was such a pivotal moment in terms of having this game that to this day is probably my top favorite game of all time. And I say to this day with a little bit of anticipation of this Tears of the Kingdom. I'm wondering, with each new Zelda game, I always have that question of, will this be the one that finally dethrones Ocarina of Time as my favorite game? It hasn't happened yet, but we'll see in just a few days. By the time you're hearing this, I don't know if I'll have an answer to that question, but you rest assured I will have played the game. So yeah, other things that happened in 2003, Nintendo actually announced the next game in August of that same year. So, so I find a GameCube in a closet. Nintendo says, hey, we're going to make another game. And then Christmas, I end up getting that GameCube. So moving on into 2004, on February 25th of 2004, Nintendo announces a Wind Waker 2 is in development and that it will be cel shaded, but also I believe it was Aonuma who decided to question, hey, why didn't the first Wind Waker perform as well as we had hoped in the US specifically? And the answer that they received, whether from some kind of statistics taken or just from the general zeitgeist of fans and what they had to say, they blamed the cel shading. I believe that the cartoony presentation might have also had a pretty solid factor. I mean, if it was just cel shading, but the game seemed to take itself seriously, I feel like there may have been a different reception. But as it stood, what was blamed was this cartoony version of Zelda wasn't what people were looking for. And to be honest, even at that point, having played the Ocarina of Time, I could see how that would be a problem. I mean, I had also played Majora's Mask. I think Anthony, back then he had a knack for presenting a game. Like if you went over to his house for a sleepover, as kids in the 90s and early 2000s were wont to do, you might spend a good number of hours with Anthony kind of going through cutscenes and favorite moments and different items and like cool abilities from a game that he's been playing. I remember going through Majora's Mask with him and him showing me each mask, what it does, why it was important, and even like letting me go through the final boss of that game. And I had never owned the game, but by the time I was done, I felt like I had a pretty solid understanding of what was in it. So though I never actually owned Majora's Mask, I had experienced Majora's Mask by this time. And so I knew The Legend of Zelda as a 3D console title to kind of come with a level of maturity, a level of seriousness. Like Nintendo had plenty of cartoony characters. They had obviously the Super Mario series. They had anything Kirby related, right? I mean, even arguably Donkey Kong games, like they were all very toony as is, and Zelda was kind of the contrast. They didn't make a cartoony Metroid. They didn't make a cartoony Zelda. I mean, or at least they shouldn't have, is what it felt like. I would come to disagree with that sentiment very, very quickly, but at the time, I can understand why people felt that way. It just seemed like they were going to take something that appealed to a different audience and try to family-friendlyify it in a way that was not good. But that being said, moving on, in May, so at E3 2004, it became very evident that the next game would no longer be a cel-shaded game based on their infamous One More World reveal right at the end of their showcase at the conference. This was the initial viewing of what Twilight Princess would be, and it was met with thunderous applause. This was a big moment, even for me at this point. I mean, I think I was in 6th grade, currently playing, Ocarina of Time and everything from the previous year, and. This was probably the first time I had actually tuned in to any kind of E3 announcement. And I don't even know that I had seen it live, but I had heard the news soon after, if not. Eventually I would try to tune into E3s more, but at this point in 6th grade, it probably wasn't happening quite yet. So this new non-cell shaded Twilight Princess would be the most anticipated of Zelda games because it seemed like a return to form. That being said, later that year in November, more screenshots were released from the E3 2004 build of the game. I think I remember these screenshots coming up in a Game Informer, and Game Informer actually kind of marking how Link looked like Jonathan Taylor Thomas in one of their little picture captions. And they're not wrong. I mean, he did look like Jonathan Taylor Thomas. I remember watching, Home Improvement, Wild America, even things like Tom and Huck, Man of the House. I mean, he was everywhere back when we were kids in the 90s. And so it really did stand out as like a comparison. And I feel like that's probably why I always remember that Game Informer made that comparison. And around that time, I mean, we had just entered the 7th grade. Now, the reason I bring that up is because Cameron and Anthony and I are all part of the same grade, same school. Back around this time, our school went from kindergarten to 6th, and then you would go into junior high for 7th and 8th, but you were in the high school building with all of the 9th to 12th graders. So it was really just kind of split up 7 years, 6 years, that kind of thing. And the reason I bring up that we went into the 7th grade is because it was our first year going into like being in the high school, our first year moving into a place where we were now the youngest people in the building. After just finally making our way to the top of the elementary school. And it would be short-lived because the next year after that, we'll get to that. So some other things to know of 2004, just some other snapshot things, right? In 2004, some cool movies came out, such as Howl's Moving Castle, National Treasure, or Phantom of the Opera. So, in December of 2004, another Christmas, and I believe for this one, I ended up getting The Wind Waker, which I did want at the time. I know that I mentioned how I could understand why it wasn't received very well, but mind you, I was already late to the game, getting Ocarina of Time 5 years after it had come out. I was hungry for the next game, and I really wanted to give Wind Waker a shot. It looked like fun to me, and it was. Honestly, for a while, after I got it especially, Wind Waker was my favorite of the series. Like, the Wind Waker had already dethroned Ocarina of Time, and it wasn't until I had replayed those games later on in life that I kind of put them back into proper positioning, in my opinion. See, the Wind Waker, though it's great in terms of exploration, like I never had any problem with exploring the oceans. I actually really enjoyed that facet of the game. I loved the random encounters you could come across, whether it was a giant squid or some pirate outpost. I thought the game was brilliant. And then playing it later on, I realized that there were very few enemy types in that game, and they would repeat the same mini bosses everywhere you went, in such a way that it actually became detrimental, because you'd go through very similar mini dungeons of very similar combat, and eventually it just became repetitive. So my issues were never the common, this is cell shaded, or there's too much ocean time. Like, those things I loved. It was the combat that actually drew me away from it. And not even that the combat was bad. It ran smooth, it controlled great. It's just that you were always seemingly fighting the same things. And I feel like that really did hurt the game. Especially when you were required to go through this repetitive combat every time you wanted to find another piece of the Triforce or another Triforce chart, which would then give you the ability to go get a piece of the Triforce. Very, very prolonged, here, fight this same monster over and over again kind of situation. So, moving into 2005, Nintendo has a pretty standard E3. They give out some game trailers for Twilight Princess, like on game cartridges. I think in 2005 we were probably looking at DS cartridges, but I don't know if that's completely accurate. We're definitely past the Game Boy Advance at this point. Later in August of 2005, Twilight Princess was delayed to post-March 2006. Now, I may have failed to mention this, but they projected that Twilight Princess would release in 2005. So back in the original E3, that One More World announcement, they also announced the next day that they expected the game to release in 2005. So 2005 was well on its way by the time August rolled around, and we were all kind of wondering, okay, is this going to be a holiday release? 2005, it's a short runway at this point. They've waited this long. What's going on? And so they gave us this announcement that it was delayed to basically Q2 of 2006, which is not what we wanted to hear, but it was a significant delay. We were all entering the 8th grade, right as that was happening. And the reason I go back to that is when I said that our entry into 7th grade and being in the high school was short-lived, our school district decided this year to implement a middle school. So they cut the whole 7-year, 6-year thing into I believe it was kindergarten through 4th, 5th through 8th, and then 9th through 12. We were now 8th graders, once again, the oldest kids in a smaller school, and we were kind of denied our high school career that we had already started. It was a very strange situation to kind of get bounced back and forth between buildings. We didn't go back to the same building we were already in, but a lot of the kids who were the same grade as us did. There was actually 2 different elementary schools that fed into the same high school. And what they did was they made one of those elementary schools into the middle school. So everybody would start at the elementary school that I started in, and then they would move over to what used to be the other elementary school and then go into the high school from there. I don't know if it was just a space issue. I believe they added a wing in order to make this all possible. And that wing was the wing that we were in. So it was at least somewhat new for everybody. In a way, I'm sure you'd have to ask somebody who actually started in the other school how they felt for real. But even for us, it just felt like we were getting dragged around, essentially. I'm sure Cameron and Anthony kind of feel the same way about that. If they were here, they could tell you. We all experienced the same thing. So some other things that happened around that time in 2005, some key movies that you might remember: The Revenge of the Sith, Star Wars Episode 3 had come out. Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire came out. I haven't really been mentioning Harry Potter too much, but all throughout this time period, I think the first one came out 2000, 2001, something like that. And they just been kind of putting them out one a year at this point. The Chronicles of Narnia came out in 2005, as did Pride and Prejudice, that Pride and Prejudice, the one with the cheekbones. And so we can move on into 2006. Now, remember that the game was originally delayed. The Twilight Princess, was originally delayed to sometime after March of 2006. So Q2 at best. However, before we could even get to Q2, February 21st, an announcement was made that they were actually expecting a fall 2006 release. And this was like the second major delay. And people were pretty upset, to say the least. We'd been just kind of waiting for this game, waiting for information at first. And now every time we got, the more specific it got, the further away it would go. And I think that that's kind of similar to how it's been with Tears of the Kingdom. We definitely had a delay into, from 2022 to 2023. And then kind of as we got into 2023, an actual date of May 12th was set. It kind of felt the same way of okay, we got to keep pushing this back a little bit. I know originally we said this day, but things have gotten rough. I mean, I think the first major Tears of the Kingdom delay was actually a COVID related delay, which is totally reasonable. I'm just seeing a similar pattern here to like how much this game is anticipated. Even down to the fact that the game was originally seen as DLC to the first game, which funnily enough was part of what it was originally planned to be, as far as I understand, until it became too big, and then they decided, no, we're gonna have to make a whole separate game because there's too many things we want to do. Which means that it's kind of feeling like, whereas Breath of the Wild, I've also heard the opinion several times that it's not a true Zelda game with its lack of dungeons and open world sandbox. You just happen to be playing as Link. To me, that resembles in a way the gripes with the Wind Waker. And it seems like Tears of the Kingdom is going to bring back a lot of things that people want to see and have come to expect, much like Twilight Princess did when it was announced. So the game was delayed to Fall 06, and in May of 2006, an actual date was given for the 19th. Not only was the 19th announced, but also they showed that the game would be releasing with the Nintendo Wii. Now, if you don't know much about that, just know that the Wii was one of the best-selling consoles ever made. Almost everybody got their hands on some Wii bowling. The motion controls were a pretty solid gimmick that worked quite well in the system's favor in terms of making it accessible for people of all ages. Your parents who never really got into gaming because, buttons can be tricky if you don't have the muscle memory and you haven't spent hours on it like we all had as kids. They could easily pick up Wii bowling and give it a shot with the fact that you just had to kind of swing your arm as if you were bowling. Obviously you could also swing your remote right into the TV and smash it. But, the starting point was there. It was very accessible for many people. And so for Twilight Princess, the vision was that the Wii system would be a great fit for a Zelda game because you could, swing the remote, or the Wiimote, I should say, swing that to swing your sword. You could draw back the Wii remote to simulate the drawing back of a bowstring. Although when the game released, you found out pretty quickly that you didn't actually have to draw back anything to draw back the bowstring. You just had to press a button, and that whole drawing back of the bow that they showed in the trailer was entirely just theatrics of the person playing the game. They just wanted to feel like they were drawing a bow. But that's kind of a side point. They did actually pump like bowstring sound effects through the speaker on the Wiimote, though. That was pretty fun. So things like that. It's the first motion control Zelda game. I know that motion controls have kind of been a detriment to the series to a lot of people. I mean, all of which in Twilight Princess and Skyward Sword, even in Breath of the Wild, having motion control puzzles, you hear a lot of complaints about those things. And I'm sure they are coming back for the Tears of the Kingdom as well, but it's always a hit or miss thing. And it always is a little bit polarizing to have that included, because Nintendo has been very big on motion controls. But that's kind of a tangent at this point. So if I'm getting back to my main points here, the game was announced for November 19th of 2006. However, come September 14th of 2006, the GameCube version was delayed to December 11th. Now, I don't know why that happened. I don't know how that happened, but I know that it did. And it became kind of a weird trade-off because you had to make a decision. Okay, like as us going into 9th grade, finally making our way back into the high school, it seemed like we were also finally going to get our Twilight Princess game. Now, if you were able to afford a Wii system, I mean, as a freshman in high school, that wasn't really something you could just do. But if, you had parents that were willing to help out with that might have looked a little different. But the thing is, this was all holiday related. It was very much a holiday 06 release, no matter which way you cut it. But for me, I know that I had pre-ordered the GameCube version of the game. Since, I had gotten the GameCube a few years into its life cycle, I just kind of assumed that the same thing would happen in my life with the Wii system. I didn't think anything of it. So I pre-ordered the GameCube disc, knowing that there were people in my grade, that would be getting the Wii system and the game day one. Whereas, I wouldn't be seeing it until let's say it was 3 weeks later that the GameCube version would come out. Things we knew, the Wii version would be mirrored so that Link could be right-handed for the first time, just to make it more analogous to the majority of people who'd be playing the game using the Wiimote in their right hand. So we knew that the entire game was flipped, not just the character. We knew that the game was originally designed for GameCube, so the graphics would be a little better on the GameCube, even though it was delayed. It was a little bit strange. We actually didn't know that until it came out. But I believe when it did come out, what we found was that it not only looked a little better, but played a little better on the GameCube. And what I knew is that I had spent my own money as a freshman in high school to try and have this game as soon as I could, which was going to be early December. What happened instead was that my mom offered to go pick up this game for me on its release day. I think she was going to go get it while I was in school. I don't remember what day of the week it was. But when everything was supposed to come together and she got home, she had told me that I was not allowed to play the game. I hadn't done anything recently to get in trouble. There was no grounding or anything like that. She had just gotten the game, picked it up, and decided that I wasn't going to be able to play it. And without any kind of explanation for that, without any kind of further detail, I lost my mind. I think I was maybe 14 at the time, and I felt injustice in my heart. And not that it was necessarily the most appropriate reaction, but I remember tears. I remember being so upset by this. Because again, I had spent my own money. I had pre-ordered this thing. I had actually done something proactive because of how much I was anticipating this game. We all were. We'd been following it for years at this point. It had been delayed so long. And this was a big deal. And so eventually my mom broke down. And what she revealed to me was that she did, in fact, go and pick up the game, but that she had gone and picked up the Wii version of the game. And that the reason that she didn't want me to play it, or didn't want me to see it even, she didn't even let me see the game until that happened, was because I was getting a Wii for Christmas. And I didn't think that would happen. I didn't put two and two together. Once again, just like with the GameCube, I had somehow spoiled my own Christmas by being curious, by asking questions, in this case, I actually felt quite wronged. But, similar situation where I didn't trust and I didn't think it through, but I ended up knowing ahead of time what was coming down the line. And I wasn't upset about that. I remember going back to school the next day and being yeah, I can't play it till Christmas because I'm getting a Wii. And being kind of excited to be one of the first people to have one. I mean, and listen, that was a shared experience. A lot of us got a Wii for Christmas that year. It was, again, one of the best selling systems of all time. But it was quite an experience to feel like I was already compromising by getting the GameCube version that would come out 3 weeks later. And then suddenly it was now you have to wait another 2 weeks before you can play the game. Even though you bought it yourself. Because she wasn't trying to say oh, we got this for you for Christmas. She was trying to say you did you bought this game, but it's compatible with something that you're getting for Christmas. But she didn't want to spoil that, so she tried to hide it, and it was not. Was it the best plan? Probably not. Was I super upset about it? After everything was said and done? No. I mean, not having the information, I think, made it so much worse. But, Christmas was always traditionally a surprise thing in our family. We didn't really know what we were getting ahead of time, usually. And it made things pretty magical, quite honestly. Some touch points for 2006. Well, not even necessarily for 2006, but for honestly right around the release of Twilight Princess. On November 17th, Casino Royale came out, as well as Happy Feet on the same day, 2 days before the Wii release. And yeah, I mean, some other things with the war was going on. I believe the trial of Saddam Hussein happened right around that time as well. If that's a touch point that you can kind of remember. I don't remember anything about that. But yeah, I mean, I think going forward and seeing this Tears of the Kingdom release, right? Like this Tears of the Kingdom is coming out. Like I said, I'm recording this May 8th, 2023, 4 days before the release. And something about the fact that we've been waiting now for, I mean, honestly, like we knew this game was in development for years now. We originally had earlier releases projected, and the further out we got, the more precise the date. And we didn't get the actual date until the delays were over with. Very similar to the way Twilight Princess's development kind of played out. So this is nothing new to someone who grew up around this time. I mean, looking back, I mean, this covered, this Wind Waker and Twilight Princess release schedule covered everything in my life from at least as far back as 4th grade through 9th grade. I mean, those are pretty significant years as a kid. Kind of moving up into the high school, moving through that stage of life where you're going from, you know, a child to an adolescent. So the memories kind of stick with you. Like, part of the reason I feel like The Legend of Zelda has been such a big deal in my life is because during this time, it was like one of my, just like probably my number one interest at the time was this game series. And so even today, whenever I'm playing a new game, I'm always relating it back to these games back here. What I will say is, even though Twilight Princess was one of the most highly anticipated games, of the three between Ocarina of Time, Wind Waker, and Twilight Princess, it's the one that I've only played once. And I really look forward to playing it again, but it is one of the longest games as well. And so I've been kind of holding off on it until we return to it with the podcast. But, you know, in the meantime, it is a game that I've always appreciated, that I've held in high regard. Though I do feel that with Nintendo, they did everything they could to give their audience what they were asking for, and ended up making a game that started off pretty slow and had relatively few memorable moments for how long of a game it was. The game, I feel like, tends to take about 5 times as long as Ocarina of Time, but only has like the same amount of story beats within it that really stick with you as you go forward. So it's not that it's a bad game by any means. I remember there were certain things in that game that still stand out to me as like top moments in the series, but it did seem like there was a lot of trying to bend to the audience and having that actually negatively affect the development. And I don't say that to try to bash it. It's still one of the best games I've ever played. It's just, it's not my favorite Legend of Zelda game, I will say. It's kind of a wild thing to look back on and just see the way that Nintendo has kind of followed these patterns. I mean, it seems like after these games, they did a lot more to try to distance themselves from producing the same game over and over again. Even with, you know, Skyward Sword was a solid deviation from the norm. Not necessarily groundbreaking, I would say. Whereas Breath of the Wild was like a very hard stop and reimagination of what the series could be, in a way that I feel like has affected gaming almost as much as Ocarina of Time has. Like, it's, you know, there's so many games that imitate and take things from Breath of the Wild. And I think what's amazing about that is that Breath of the Wild at this point was what I honestly feel we might all just be calling the groundwork for Tears of the Kingdom at this point. I know that they run in the same engine from what I've heard. And it really seems like the mechanics, I mean, they're going to be adding so many different things that you can do in the game. But at its heart is the fact that Breath of the Wild came out and laid the groundwork for this game to be possible, which is very exciting. And in my head, I'm really hoping that this is another great revolution in gaming. I mean, it'd be wild to have one just 6 years after the last. But I think that if anyone's going to do it, it's going to be this company and this franchise. So I'm looking forward to it. I'm as hyped as ever. I'm as excited for this as I was for Twilight Princess. Which is to say more than I was excited for games like Wind Waker or Skyward Sword, or even Breath of the Wild for that matter. Like, I had high hopes, but I don't know that I was like counting down the days, you know. But this game seems like it's worthy of that kind of hype, and if it's true, we'll all be having the time of our lives over this next season. And I hope that you guys can join us for that season. Speaking of which, I can kind of wrap this up now. I appreciate you all coming in here and listening to my ramblings, my memoir, if you will, my audio journal of past events. I know that it wasn't necessarily a funny episode as much as it probably was just getting to know me a little bit better, getting to know my history with the games a little bit better. You know, in the in-between seasons, we always try to do something a little bit different. So listen, I hope that you guys can all join us for our Tears of the Kingdom season. It's going to be running way less organized. We're planning on kind of just chatting up our experiences with the game the same way we would if we were back in high school playing Twilight Princess. Just kind of talking to each other about where we got to, what we've accomplished, what we've seen, what we love, what we don't. I'm sure we're going to have a blast with it. And you know what? We'll come up with a format that helps bring some kind of organization to it. We just don't have that locked down just yet. But y'all, thank you so much for listening, and we'll catch you next time on A for No, B for Yes. Did you get all that?